Women's voting rights were first recognized in Wyoming in 1869 at the gathering of the first Wyoming Territorial Legislature. The legislature decided to pass women's suffrage for a variety of reasons. Probably foremost among them was the hope that this would publicize the new territory. It was in a lot of need of attracting women and families to the new territory, especially if it wanted to become a state, and the people at the legislature wanted it to become a state. At the time, Wyoming had a male-to-female ratio of 6-to-1, and a lot of the 6, where the men were concerned, were transitory single men, and so in the long-haul prospects for becoming a state depended on attracting women. There was also the fact that Wyoming became a territory in the midst of the Reconstruction battles following the Civil War. And the territorial legislature was dominated by individuals who had a problem with the requirements that the U.S. Congress were passing to bring the former Confederate states back in the Union. They were railing against the passage of the 14th Amendment, which called for equal protection of the laws for the freed people. And they were very upset about the 15th Amendment, which extended voting rights to freed men. And a lot of people had the attitude that if freed men can vote, then by golly, white women should be able to as well. And so you have that factoring in. Party politics also played a role tied to Reconstruction because the legislature was locally elected, and at the time, definitely, Wyoming was very much a Democratic, more pro-Confederate stronghold, or at least not pro-emancipation stronghold, I should say. You have the Democratic legislature passing a measure that they want to see the presidential appointee, Republican Governor John Campbell, veto it, so they could argue that this Republican favors black men over white women. Then there's also the fact that there were some who believed in the justice of the measure. They had heard of the women's suffrage movement. Earlier in 1869, Dakota Territory came within one vote of approving of women's suffrage, and Wyoming was divided from Dakota Territory. And so you do have some who really believe in it. The man who introduced the bill, William Bright, combined a lot of these elements. He believed in the justice of it, arguing that his wife, Julia, should have the right to vote, especially, though, if black men could vote. And he, as a leader in the legislature, wanted to do anything he could to attract people to the new territory. There was buyer's remorse on the part of that first territorial legislature for adding women's suffrage to the Constitution. 2 years after the first legislature met, the second met in 1871 and voted to rescind women's suffrage. The governor, Campbell, vetoed that, and then the legislature almost overrode it. It came within one vote of overriding the veto. The people had been upset because women did vote, but they tended to vote more Republican than they did Democratic. And that was not welcomed by the legislature. The women who came with families tended to be more middle class and upper middle class, which in the late 1860s in Wyoming meant Republican, whereas the legislature represented more the dominant male working class families who tended to vote Democratic, and that the women tended to vote for the Republicans was seen as ingratitude by the legislature, and so they voted to rescind women's suffrage. On top of voting for the wrong party, women were very much annoying people because they tended to be tough on crime when they were on a jury. And especially if it was a crime that involved alcohol. You can't blame him because he was drunk, or we have to be lenient. It didn't carry very well with the women. And Wyoming recognizing women's right to vote gave the national movement to acknowledge women's rights a lot more leverage in their arguments, especially in their arguments with the naysayers. Two of the most consistent arguments used against women voting were that it would destroy the home, and people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony could say, look, they're voting in Wyoming and the homes are still standing. Another argument frequently used to say, no, women shouldn't vote, was based on biology. Doctors, including in the American Medical Association, often posited that a woman's body has enough blood for their uterus to work or their brain to work, but not both. And so women voting risked women becoming infertile. And so you could say, the National Women's Rights Movement could say, look, Wyoming, they're still having children, so this isn't a danger. Recognizing women's voting rights did lead to an increase in the number of women holding office in Wyoming. Wasn't hard because there hadn't been any before. Wyoming has a lot of firsts. We had the first female judge in the country, Esther Hobart Morris. You have the first woman holding a statewide elected position, Estelle Real, as superintendent of public instruction. You have the first female governor elected, Nellie Taylor Ross. Where Wyoming tends to fall short is we don't have very many seconds. Nellie Taylor Ross, for example, was the first governor in the nation, the first female and only female governor of Wyoming. Why this is the case, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that women don't tend to be given second chances, or they're less likely to be given a second chance if they make a mistake, or they make a perceived mistake, or they cause a controversy of some kind. People react, and Nellie Taylor Ross, for example, is elected governor in the 1920s, and she is one of those who feels that prohibition needs to be enforced. When male sheriffs didn't always enforce those laws, she intervened, and she gets payback for that. She confronts the Old Boys Network, which is very strong and well organized in Wyoming, as in many areas. And so as long as you don't overturn that old network, women made a lot of progress. When they ran into it, though, sometimes they weren't allowed another chance. One of the things that prevents women, in my opinion, from enjoying complete equality in Wyoming, despite us being the equality state, has a lot to do with the economy in Wyoming, which itself is tied to the climate here. Wyoming started out in a much more progressive manner, and embarked on a lot of progressive reforms in the 1890s and early 1900s. There's a rumor that Cecil B. DeMille almost established Hollywood in Wyoming. There were, with the Union Pacific Railway, we got all of the Broadway shows from Cheyenne all the way to Evanston along the railway route. And there seemed to be a lot of cultural potential and potential for economic development and hopes for that. And the weather put the kibosh on a lot of it. And if you look across the United States and you look at the world as a whole, the places where women enjoy the highest level of socioeconomic prosperity relative to men, the highest political participation and representation vis-a-vis men, tend to be places where you have economic diversification. And so Wyoming not having a diversified economy is something that has seriously impacted women's equality. Wyoming today has the highest gender pay gap in the nation for full-time, year-round paid employees. It's the average full-time employed woman makes $21,000 less per capita than the average full-time employed man. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that our industries tend to be fairly limited. And the natural resource industry is very critical to Wyoming, but it tends to be a very male-dominated industry. It's not dominated by law, which is a great advancement over where things had been, but it is more male-dominated. And so you have a few professions in Wyoming that tend to be female-dominated, nursing, for example, or elementary education, both of which are well-paying jobs. But the more technical, more well-paying jobs that you might find in some of the surrounding states in the mountain region or in the more economically diverse states, you simply don't have here, and that makes it a struggle.